Hello and welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast. I'm Joost, your coach over at Pace Buddies. And in today's episode, I talk to Dr. Michael Lindinger, an exercise physiologist, an expert on everything lactate. Because every runner knows that feeling. The legs start to burn, you're breathing hard, and something forces you to back off. And almost all of us have been told that that thing that's happening is lactate acid. That's the burning sensation in your muscles. My guest today has spent decades showing that that is wrong and that the real story is something entirely different and very interesting. Dr. Michael Lindinger is an exercise physiologist and professor at the University of Guelph, Canada. He was part of the early research that measured what actually happens to lactate and acid in working muscles, and he spent his career untangling what causes that burning sensation. In this conversation, we get into what lactate actually is, where it comes from, why the burning in your legs isn't what you think it is, and whether any of it is trainable. One practical note before we start, we had some technical issues with this recording, so the audio quality may differ from places to places, but the conversation is absolutely worth the listen. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Michael. Welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast.
Thank you, Joost. It's a pleasure to be here and talk with you today.
I'm really looking forward to our chat and to the physiology of running and what happens when our legs are burning. But maybe first, can you talk something about yourself, who you are, how you became interested in physiology, and what's your background?
Yeah, my background is in what's called comparative animal physiology. I started working with fish and amphibians in my early days, and then when I was doing my PhD, I was working in a human physiology department at McMaster University with some really good exercise physiologists. And so there I started doing some work on very high intensity exercise, mostly cycling, repeated bouts of very high intensity exercise that caused very large increases in muscle and blood lactate concentrations, very large decreases in muscle and blood pH. And so we were sort of the first group to sort of characterize these very big changes and to look at the time course of recovery. Since then, we've continued to do a lot of human exercise physiology, some horse exercise physiology, and some work on other animals. And more recently, I've moved into the nutraceutical space, looking at the beneficial effects of food type products on health outcomes.
Okay, it's also a very fascinating field. Yeah, perfect. And you say you did a lot of research into lactate. For years, we thought that lactate or lactic acid was the culprit of our burning muscles when we run. But what is lactate in our bodies?
Yeah, so lactate is a metabolic. I'm going to call it a metabolic fuel because that's actually what it is. It used to be thought of as a metabolic waste product, and that came from some work done in the 1930s by a German group. And what they noticed that when they stimulated muscles, electrically stimulated muscles that were in isolation without blood flow, sort of in a test tube, they were able to measure very large increases in lactic acid. And at the same time, fatigue happened. And so they thought this was cause and effect, but we now know that's not cause and effect. It's an association, or at best, there's a contribution of lactate and acid to the fatigue that happens with high intensity exercise. So that notion from the 1930s has actually continued through for almost 100 years as a myth that lactate causes fatigue, that lactate causes pain. Despite the fact that in the last 30 years, direct evidence has shown that if you apply lactate or if you apply acid to the pain-sensitive nerves and muscles, the C3, C4 nerves, you get very little pain effect, very little pain response. So studies like that have been very useful in sort of helping dispel the myth. And a lot of really good studies by George Brooks out of Berkeley, California, has shown that the lactate is actually a metabolic fuel. The whole system of lactate metabolism was sort of turned sideways by George's work and some of the work that we did with him and others have done. And I think most importantly, we used to think that lactate is a poison in the muscle and the muscle gets rid of it, which is why lactate increases in the blood. But now we know that if you allow lactate to stay in the muscles, it can actually use it. And in fact, it doesn't have to be converted to pyruvate before it gets oxidized in the mitochondria. It can go directly into the mitochondria and be oxidized as metabolic fuel. It's really, really interesting. We did some studies with George and Ben Miller where we actually infused lactate into human subjects. We did this at McMaster University. And when we did that, we could not measure an increase in blood lactate concentration. We just had wide open on the flow of lactate in, and the muscles were just taking it up right away and oxidizing. It's metabolic fuel. So very interesting. And so what we had to try to do then is, what is causing fatigue? What is causing pain with high intensity exercise? And so I've spent a lot of time working with other people, including Simon Cairns in New Zealand, trying to understand some of the causes of fatigue. But I haven't worked very much on the side of what causes the pain, and I've done some of the reading on that. But.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So when we infuse lactate, it's just maybe not the right term, but it's like eating a gel of carbs. It's just going to be used as a fuel.
Yeah, so increasingly you will find lactate supplements, oral lactate supplements, or lactate that's present with electrolyte solutions. And that's a really good thing, because one of the things we found when we did this study with people is that when you provided the lactate, the muscles actually took up less glucose. So it has a glucose sparing effect, which is, a good thing with endurance exercise. With endurance exercise, we are never really increasing blood lactate concentrations very much.
Glycolysis is just fast breakdown of sugar for energy. It runs all the time, but it ramps up when you push hard.
We continue to produce lactate at an elevated rate because glycolytic metabolism is elevated. But if we provide lactate orally and it gets taken up into the blood, then that lactate will actually have a glucose sparing effect. So you don't have to mobilize glucose from the liver. You don't have to break down glycogen from the muscle as fast. So it can actually help you maintain, your pace with endurance activity, increase your time to fatigue. So I think lactate as a oral supplement for endurance is a really good thing.
And is that something already being produced, or is that something we can see in the? Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it's available. You have to look for it, but I'm pretty sure if you Google it, you can find it. I didn't do that just before coming on here, but I am aware of
course.
Them.
Yeah. Okay.
And
that's so interesting.
And for me, it makes perfect sense. And it's all about dispelling the myths, right? That lactate doesn't cause fatigue, and that I wrote an editorial for an equine paper. Lactate is a poison or metabolic fuel for horses with high intensity exercise, right? And it's that whole idea that it actually is a very important metabolic fuel. Not only is it used by our muscle cells, the contracting muscle cells during exercise, it's also used by the non-contracting muscle cells and virtually by every cell in our bodies, including brain cells. So we used to think that the brain was an obligate glucose user.
Mm-hmm.
But if you provide the brain with lactate and glucose, many of the cells will preferentially take up the lactate, particularly the astrocytes. Yeah, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So that's the way we have to start thinking about lactate now. It's really, really important for all the cells in our body. It's expensive to create it using glycolysis, so why not keep it and then use it and generate, to get all the rest of the ATP out of it, right?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Absolutely, yeah. And where is lactate made in our bodies?
Yes. So
Before we continue, if this conversation is resonating with you, chances are you're the kind of runner who wants to train smarter and not harder. That's exactly who I work with at Pace Buddies. I coach recreational runners to achieve their personal best, who are serious about building real aerobic fitness. The kind of fitness that actually shows up on race day. So if you're looking for one-on-one personalized coaching, head over to pacebuddies.com and book a 30-minute free consultation call with me.
lactate is made in the cells of our bodies whenever the demand for ATP from mitochondrial metabolism is not adequate. So these are, for example, the rest to work transition for skeletal muscle, when we increase or when we go from a lower work intensity to a higher work intensity. So if you're running along and you're just cruising and then you hit a hill and you don't want to lose your position, you're going to increase your work intensity. So during that time, you will get an increase in lactate production, and you may also experience some burning and pain and discomfort as you approach the top of that slope. So those are times when lactate is being produced in elevated concentrations, elevated amounts in muscle, and some of that lactate starts showing up in the blood. So the other time that lactate is produced, and if we take it outside of an exercise situation, is in any situation where there is trauma or a decrease in an impairment of blood flow and therefore oxygen delivery to cells, whether it's liver cells, brain cells, intestinal cells, what have you. Whenever oxygen delivery is not adequate, there will be an increase in glycolytic metabolism and lactate production. So people have incorrectly termed this anaerobic metabolism, which is not quite right, because anaerobic means in the absence of oxygen. But just because the blood flow is not adequate doesn't mean that oxygen is absent. It just means that you're not able to have enough oxygen to provide ATP aerobically from the mitochondria. So it still is an aerobic environment. It's just that the ATP demand cannot be met solely by mitochondrial respiration. So we bring in glycolytic metabolism. So rest to work transitions with exercise are the ones that are most important for endurance athletes. Rest to work and then lower intensity to higher intensities. And you feel that fatigue happening, you start this, and you can feel some of the burn that happens.
Yeah.
So the fatigue, we know that the fatigue has a lot to do with changes in the balance of potassium and sodium across the muscle cell membranes and the nerve cell membranes. So at least 50% of the fatigue that we feel when we do these things is from muscle cell membrane effects. And some of it translates down into calcium release and calcium recycling within the muscle. There is a small component, it looks like, from lactate production and from the acidosis, and it seems to contribute to fatigue, but that also is very tied in with phosphate metabolism in muscle. And phosphate's very interesting in muscle because one of the really important metabolites with these transitions from lower to higher intensity is the ability to break down phosphocreatine.
Phosphocreatine is your muscle's instant energy, a tiny reserve that fires immediately before the slower systems catch up. It lasts maybe 10 to 20 seconds.
And this is a very important ATP producing system because it's instantaneous. It takes, about 30 seconds to really ramp up glycolytic metabolism, lactate production, and produce ATP, but the phosphocreatine system can generate ATP literally instantaneously. So when you have people doing 100-meter sprints, that's almost entirely based on ATP produced from the phosphocreatine system. After glycolytic metabolism from that 10-second sprint is massively elevated, and you will get lactate production. But the energy during that period of time is from phosphocreatine. So when you break down phosphocreatine, you get a big increase in phosphate, and phosphate together with the acid production from glycolytic metabolism increases the acidic forms of phosphate in muscle, and that has fatiguing effects. There's some very nice studies that have been done in the past 5 years that show these very profound fatiguing effects. And the basic work for that goes back to some experiments done on rabbit muscle by Cook and Pate in the 1980s. So it goes back a ways as well.
And the phosphate system, it's instantly, but it's also short-lived, I believe. How long you can use it?
Right. So it's a very short-lived. So as I said, it's very short-lived, very instantaneous, maybe 10 to 20 seconds max. And during that time, as you get a ramp up of the glycolytic metabolism, and at the same time, you're also getting an increase in the activity of aerobic enzymes. So all the systems are increasing gradually over time. So it's not step by step by step. That doesn't make sense for human physiology. There's just gradual increases, everything ramps up. And it's an integrated, coordinated process of trying to meet the energy demand. So it's really elegant when you look at it that way.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, it's a wondrous system how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if we take a look at more the endurance events, you spoke about the 100 meters, maybe a half marathon, marathon runner. It's not that noticeable the burning, but we do interval training, and that's when we feel the burn. And is that
Yes.
also the phosphate system?
Yeah. So there are small contributions of acid and lactate to these pain-sensitive nerve endings in muscle, the C3, C4, but they're not at all like what you get from the cytokines.
Quick note, the C3 and C4 nerves he mentions are the pain-sensing nerves in your muscle. Their job is to tell your brain something is happening. Cytokines are signaling molecules your muscle release when it's working hard. Think of them as tiny messengers, not the damage itself. Interleukin 6 is the main one for the burn.
So things like interleukin 1, interleukin 6, tumor alpha necrosis factor, these are the really important cytokines, and some of these are myokines, i.e. they are actually released by muscle cells. And some are just elevated in the blood from other sources, but they contribute when they're elevated in concentration. These C3, C4 muscle fibers, they have an increase in the rate of firing. So they're stimulated by the increases in concentration of these cytokines, and that causes the sensation of pain during the period of exercise. After exercise, you have other things going on too, like I've run marathons, half marathons, and my legs are sore when I stop. And then 2 days or 3 days later, then you have another bout of muscle soreness. So all of those things are not associated with lactate. You can measure lactate and acid in muscles, 10 minutes after the kind of exercise we do with endurance running. And the concentrations are low. They're very low. We've measured concentrations with very high intensity exercise that are 40 millimolar lactate. Sometimes some people even higher. 40 millimolar. It's crazy, right? So we take muscle biopsies, analyze the samples, and it's really, really high. But they recovered this very quickly. And so it's not the lactate, and muscles don't retain lactate. They will either oxidize it or they will release it. And usually they're doing both at the same time when they're producing it at high rates. So, within a half an hour of stopping high intensity exercise, there's almost no lactate left in the muscles. It's back down to normal resting levels, which is about 4 millimoles per liter. So it's other things. With strenuous exercise, there's a lot of micro tearing that goes on. And so there's damage to the microfibers in the muscle. And when that happens, then we have an increase in reactive oxygen species. We have damage to the muscle cell membranes. We have leakage of things out of the muscle cells. And there's this local inflammatory response. Well, some of that can happen very quickly. And that's the pain that you feel sometimes even when you're running and you just keep pushing through that pain. Say it's your last 3K on that marathon. Most people are running through pain to get, they have a goal in mind that they want to reach, they want to do a 3-hour marathon and they can do it if they run as hard as they can for that last 3K. And that's running through pain. And that's not lactate. because you're still running slow. You've just done a marathon. There's nothing there to produce lactate. Your glycogen's gone. You're running on whatever you got left, and it's probably fat, right? You're probably burning the residuals of fat, some amino acids. And so during that time, you're feeling that pain and discomfort, and that's from these cytokines that are coming out. You've done a lot of muscle damage running a marathon. The day after running a marathon, you can't walk downstairs without feeling that pain in your quads, right? It's painful because there's a lot of micro damage, and that pain doesn't go away. It actually continues to build for a day or two or three, and then you get the period. So that's the period where you really start to break down some of the muscle and you get inflammation. And that causes this whole cascade of things and muscle swelling. And when the muscles swell, that actually exacerbates it, makes worse the sensation of pain. You just press the swollen muscle and it's painful. Then there's this replacement of damaged tissue, and that takes a period of about 2 to 3 weeks where you slowly replace and repair all the damaged muscle. And during that time, the muscle's going to be a little bit sensitive, a little bit painful. But lactate isn't present above resting level. It's normal. Yeah. The cytokines are there though, and they're and I think it's a nice system because the cytokines are acting as a signal. You're telling the brain through the pain sensitive nerve endings in your muscle that you've got an issue here. You can go through this, but you're going to experience more damage and more pain. Or you can slow down, or you can stop, and the pain will stop, or at least it'll be reduced, right? So it's a good sort of feedback and feed forward system to let you know where you're at in terms of your physiology for running.
Yeah, it acts like some kind of messenger to your brain from stop to prevent further. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Very much so. Yeah.
And when we do intervals, we say it's a lactate workout, or we're clearing our lactate. What happens when the lactate is rising in our blood? What's that process?
And that's fair enough to call it that, because that is what's happening. You are getting an increase in lactate production during those higher sessions. If you're doing fartleks or whatever, you are. There's no doubt. I think the whole idea behind that kind of training, though, is to actually increase the rate of aerobic metabolism so that you can use aerobic metabolism. You can use fat. You can burn fat to produce the ATP that you need. In the interim, you're always going to be relying on glycolysis and lactate production to provide the ATP that you need for that higher intensity of exercise. But the whole idea with the training is to continue to increase your reliance on burning fat as a fuel. When you look at elite cyclists, when you look at the respiratory exchange ratios, even at really high workloads, they are getting 90% of their ATP from burning fat, which is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Whereas us, when we're running, maybe we're getting up to 70, 75. Maybe some of your top elite marathoners are, 80 to 85% fat burning, which is amazing. So that's where we want to be for endurance exercises, is because we have lots of reserves of fat. It's an almost infinite pool of ATP.
Yeah, and when we burn fat, there's no lactate being produced or used in the mitochondria.
Well, it is being produced and it is being used, but it's completely imbalanced, right? So we can never turn it off, right? It's always on. And when we're moving, when we're exercising, it's always on at an elevated rate, but it's being used as fast as it's being produced.
Yeah. Because even when we sit here, like now, we're even producing lactate, right? That's my understanding, at least. Yeah. And where is that lactate is going to, what you mentioned, to the brain and to other tissues that can use up the lactate. So it's always in balance.
That's right. So, when you measure across a tissue bed, we call it the arterial venous difference. The arterial is the blood supply going in, the vein is the blood leaving. And when you measure the difference in concentration between the arterial side and the venous side, you will always see that on the venous side, lactate is lower in a resting person. So it's very interesting when you look at it that way. And we showed that with people with very high intensity exercise, that the legs, if you're doing cycling exercise or running,
Mm-hmm.
the venous concentrations in the legs, the contracting muscles, are very high. But then if you measure it in the arm at the same time, which we've done, then the lactate concentrations are much, much lower. So we're using the entire body as a system of sort of buffering the changes and not allowing the lactate to go to waste. We keep it in the body.
That's so fascinating. That it's even different within the body and the concentrations of lactate.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And we've talked about fat burning. When we increase the intensity or we do an interval of some kind, we decrease fat burning and we increase the glycolysis. And that's when lactate is starting to get.
Yeah, so whenever we increase the intensity, or if we run out of fat, which is almost impossible. So usually it's when you increase intensity, then that's where you're going to get the increase in lactate production. Yeah. So long as you have glycogen reserves in muscle and glycogen reserves in liver, right? So you need to have the glucose being released from the liver. And there's a limit. It's almost impossible to bring muscle glycogen concentrations down below about 40 or 50% of the resting concentrations. There seems to be a limit. So I don't know if it's a safety mechanism. In the liver, you can bring it down to maybe 10% of, pre-exercise levels during periods of exercise. But you can run out of glucose sources for muscle during endurance exercise. That's what we refer to as hitting the wall, right? So when you run out of glucose, then you're having to rely only on fat. You can continue to exercise, but the intensity is always lower. So carbohydrates allow you to exercise at a higher intensity without any difficulty, so long as you have adequate sources of glucose present. And some of that can be from oral supplements, and most endurance athletes are taking oral glucose or some kind of carbohydrate blend to help exercise.
Yeah, exactly. To keep being fueled during the exercise we're doing.
Yeah.
And the lactate, when we go harder, it's rising. Does that mean that our bodies can't recover enough to burn that lactate, to use that lactate?
Well,
or how do we clear it again?
Yeah, so it is increasing, and it is being used by the contracting muscles, and some of it's being released into the blood. And the lactate that's being released in the blood is actually cleared very quickly. So in those studies where we increased muscle lactate concentrations to 40 millimoles per liter, it took an hour and a half to completely recover the blood acid-base state. Lactate recovered in about 30 to 40 minutes. pH would take about an hour and a half to fully recover, because there's different things going on with acid-base regulation. It's not just lactate. Lactate contributes about 50% to the acidosis of exercise, and other things contribute to the other 50%. So the lactate is very rapidly cleared. As soon as we stop, or as soon as we lower the intensity, then lactate production comes into balance with lactate utilization, and we have no net change. It's just continuous or constant. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why we have the rest intervals as well between the sets, so we can clear it again and get into balance again.
That's right. So that's the whole idea, is that you want to clear it, you want to get back down, and you want to continue to try to stimulate aerobic metabolism, the ability to use the mitochondria to burn fat. So that's the whole idea. We want to just keep increasing that and pushing up the activity of those oxidative enzymes in the mitochondria. So that's all about driving the mitochondria to burn fat faster. Some of that has to do with, of course, you need to take the fat up into the muscle. There's enzymes and transporters on muscle cell membranes. And with a training program, all of those gradually increase over a period of weeks and months. Okay, and we all have a genetic potential that we're trying to reach, and some have a much greater genetic potential than others.
Yeah. Sometimes life is unfair.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And in your paper I read from you, there was also some explanation about the H ions. When glycolysis happens, lactate is being produced. It's also being in glycolysis, H ions are being produced and being used again with lactate. How does that work, that system, and why is that important for endurance events?
Right. So H ions are protons or hydrogen ions, and they are what we call acid. Right. It's the acid part. At least it's what we measure when there's an increase in acidosis, there's an increase in H plus or H ion concentration. There's a lot of things that contribute to hydrogen ion concentration. It's not just lactate. Electrolyte imbalances are one of the biggest things that contribute to acidosis with exercise. So lactate in the body is mostly in the form of the anion. It's not associated with H ion. It's just lactate as an anion, which is lactate. It's not lactic acid. It's actually lactate. Lactic acid means that lactate and H ion are associated, and they're not. In physiological fluids for mammals, they're mostly dissociated. Over 90% is dissociated. So lactate is what we call, it's a strong acid anion. It's like chloride. Chloride's another strong acid anion. And when they're out of balance with strong base cations, things like sodium and potassium and calcium and magnesium, those are all positively charged.
Here's the surprising part. A cation is just a positively charged mineral, like sodium, calcium, or magnesium. His point? Bicarbonate doesn't work the way people may think. It's the sodium riding along that does the job, not the buffering. Don't worry about the chemicals here. The one idea, the mineral does the work. The rest gets used up or breathed out.
If those concentrations of negatively charged anions are high, like we get with exercise and lactate is high, then we have an increase in acidosis. So we have an increase in hydrogen ion. And again, some studies in the early 1960s made this cause and effect conclusion that acidosis causes fatigue. So there's a lot of things where increased hydrogen ion does interact with metabolism and slows down the rate of some of the enzymes involved in metabolism, energy metabolism. So there is a contribution of increased H+, but it's not a sole cause. There's a lot of other things going on.
Yeah.
When lactate is consumed, because you're bringing down that strong acid anion concentration, that then reduces the acidosis. All right, so it's the removal of the lactate itself that helps bring the H ion back down into a pre-exercise level. And think of it this way. We have a very large concentration of water in our bodies and in our cells. And hydrogen ion is only part of water, H2O. It's hydrogen and oxygen. So whenever we do that, the H+ in our bodies is always in equilibrium with all of the water. And the lactate interacts with that equilibrium with water and H+. So again, it's a very elegant system and very integrated system. But, all we really need to do to decrease acidosis is metabolize that lactate, and the cells are really good at doing that, clearing the lactate.
And is that something that we can train as well in our endurance training? That clearing?
Yeah. I think, with the interval work that you talked about doing, I think that's exactly what we're doing. Yeah. So with the interval training for endurance exercise, we have lactate transporters and muscle cell membranes.
These transporters are basically doors in the muscle wall that move lactate in and out. That's the thing training improves.
And some of the transporters are involved in moving the lactate out of the muscle cells and into the blood. And we have other ones that are actually more involved in moving the lactate back into muscle cells. So the ones that are moving lactate out of muscle, they help reduce the acidosis that's inside muscle. So that's one of the things we want to train for, is reducing the acidosis in muscle because it does contribute to fatigue. And so by moving lactate out, we reduce the acidosis, and that helps us to continue to exercise. For recovery and for the non-contracting tissues, maybe, but we don't know for sure, maybe we can also increase the activity of the transporters in those cells that are removing the lactate from the blood. The elevated lactate in the blood does contribute to the acidosis in the blood, and that may have an effect on fatigue as well.
Yeah.
But I think the main effects of the interval work is to, train both the glycolytic system and the oxidative systems to operate at a higher level, at a higher intensity, so that we can run faster. If we start out as a runner, we know that we run slow. And, as a training paradigm, we sort of use the long, slow distance paradigm for starting out. And that's to slowly bring the enzyme systems into play. And then as we actually can complete a 10K run or a 20K run, then we can start increasing the intensity and the duration and bring the glycolytic systems and the aerobic fat burning systems up in intensity.
Yeah, so it's a longer process. We're building the base first, the long slow miles, and then we bring in the faster repetitions. So we're working on everything together. So acidosis is probably the culprit of the burning sensation and the fatiguing part in the run.
The acidosis may contribute to the burning sensation, but it's the release of cytokines from muscle that are the main culprit for the burning sensation. So the interleukin 6, those are the main ones that are going to be causing the pain sensation. So they're produced by muscle, they're released by muscle, and it's part of that messenger system that muscle has that, hey, I'm working hard. You can keep going, but it's going to hurt, buddy. So you decide what you want to do. I'm just telling you where things are at. But it's not so much the acidosis. By far, it's the interleukins that are providing the main pain signal to those pain-sensitive nerves.
Yeah, and those interleukins that were the messengers we've spoken about. That's signaling to our brain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and is it this happening mostly in our fast twitch muscles, or also in our slow twitch muscles?
Yeah, so probably mostly in the faster twitch muscles, because we feel this in those transitions where we're going from lower intensity to higher intensity, right? So when we're doing interval training or when we're doing hill work, those are transitions from lower to higher intensity. It's not rest to work. So, and when we do those transitions, we're almost, we're going away from our slow oxidative fibers and our fat and our slow oxidative glycolytic fibers. The slow oxidative fibers, they can go all day. They do produce lactate. They do take lactate up and oxidize it very, very well. But they're not big lactate producers. It's the fast glycolytic fibers that are the big lactate producers, the type 2 fibers. And those are the ones that we're really trying to train, I think. I think we're also trying to train the fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. Those are very trainable. We sort of have a fixed population of fast glycolytic fibers and slow oxidative fibers, but it seems to be the fast oxidative glycolytic fibers we can increase the population of those with certain types of training. It's a different situation for fast glycolytic fibers that you use with resistance training and heavy weights. Those are trainable too, but it's a very different system than what we're using for endurance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And nowadays you hear a lot about supplements that can maybe buffer or help with that burning sensation. Is there some truth to it, like beta-alanine or other sodium bicarbonate? Those act like buffers. Is there any studies as you know, maybe?
Yeah, so bicarbonates have been used a lot because we know that you can, with certain types of activities, you can actually get an increase in performance. And these are moderate to high intensity, very intensity exercises. So you don't get that effect with endurance exercise. With running marathons, we don't need to have a bicarbonate supplement. And in the bicarbonate supplement, what we're really doing with a bicarbonate supplement is providing sodium. And sodium is a strong base cation, and it counteracts the acidosis. It brings the pH down, has the opposite effect of increases in lactate. So, people oversimplify it and think of, well, it's H plus reacting with bicarbonate. That's way oversimplified to, relative to what's actually happening in the body. And it's the sodium that's the driver. So you can put in, potassium bicarbonate, calcium citrate, calcium lactate, magnesium lactate, all of these different types of things, but it's that cation that's going to be exerting that beneficial effect. The sodium, the magnesium, the calcium, the potassium on reducing the acidosis. So if we need to have that, then those supplements that have those cation salts with something like citrate or bicarbonate or succinate or lactate, all of those are going to be beneficial. And as an oral supplement for increasing your ability to exercise. And the reason that those work is because citrate is utilized by cells, lactate is utilized by cells, bicarbonate's in equilibrium with water and the CO2 system. So any excess is either breathed out or it's eliminated. So all of those work really well, and they leave the cation behind. And that cation is what has the lowering effect on the acidosis. So those studies definitely help support the idea that acidosis does contribute to fatigue, and it does contribute. So if you can reduce the acidosis with this type of supplementation, then that's going to be beneficial. So again, it points out it's not just lactate. Like lactate contributes, but you can also provide something with lactate, like calcium lactate, and it will actually have a beneficial effect.
Yeah. Well, as we see now, it's a more complex system than just saying, well, I have a lactate in my system and it's burning my muscles. But it's what's been said so much, even at sporting events. Oh, you can see the lactic acid building up there, and the grin on the face.
You hear it all the time. Yeah, we hear it from massage therapists. They're saying, they're giving massage, hours or days after, and it's like, oh, you got lactic acid buildup in your muscle. Well, you don't. There's hundreds of studies now that show that there's no lactate left in your muscles, and so I've written articles and worked with people, for getting stuff out there to the massage therapist and other areas, and it's interesting that this myth that was started 100 years ago is it's still so promoted. I'm amazed because there's so much good science out there. There's literally hundreds of really good research papers, and there's only a handful of studies that were done 100 years ago that where all this started from. It's amazing how slow it changes to take the edge off these myths.
And to bring this home, when an athlete says, well, I have to clear my lactate acid, I'm training it, how would we explain in simple terms what's actually happening? And it's not a lactic acid, but that lactate is fuel. How would you explain something like that to an athlete in simple terms?
Well, if they're doing the interval work, I think, the fact that you're actually clearing lactate is true. You are clearing the lactate, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, I think the more important thing is that you're actually increasing the activities of the enzymes that are involved in aerobic metabolism. And it's that which is going to help you perform at a higher level as you train and as you continue to train. The lactate producing their system is a stopgap, and it's a little bit more than a stopgap. It's there, and then it's a trainable system too. If you know that when you start training and you do that hill work, first few times you do that hill work, it's slow, but you get better at it. Not just because you're actually burning fat at a faster rate. You're actually producing lactate at a faster rate and better able to generate ATP through glycolysis and better able to utilize that lactate that's being produced as well. And that's contributing to the increase in work intensity that you're able to do. So the clearing lactate, it's a good way of looking at it, because that is what's happening. You are producing it at an elevated rate and you're clearing it at an elevated rate. And at the same time, the aerobic enzyme systems are all being upregulated as part of your training, and everything working together is going to increase your performance.
Yeah, we're building a more efficient energy system within our bodies to do
Yes.
the work requires.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
Good.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Michael. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about lactate, what it is, what it isn't, and how we can train it.
It's been great talking with you about it too.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is there somewhere people can find you, or they can get more information about the lactate systems and acidosis and your studies?
Yeah, so people can find me on Google, so it's really easy. So just drop me an email. Like, there's about 3 or 4 different emails I use, and any one of them is going to be fine. I'll find it. So yeah, just reach out, and I'll be happy to get in touch.
No, thank you very much, and who knows, until next time.
All right, thank you, Yus. All the best. Bye.
That's a wrap for today's episode, and thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the Aerobic Ed podcast, the best thing you can do is leave a review at Spotify or Apple Podcast. It just takes a few minutes and helps other runners to find the show. And if you want to take your training to the next level, come and talk to me. I work with recreational runners who want a structured, evidence-based approach to building real aerobic fitness. The first call is free. You'll find the link in the show notes or over at Pace Buddy. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next one.